que el Comité Especial recomienda deban tomarse para hacer frente a este desastre, tanto desde el punto de vista humanitario como en términos de acciones políticas internacionales. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lesotho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Malaysia for the report of the special committee. We have had, Mr. Chairman, year after year, non-cooperation by Israel with the special committee. And I wanted to find out what the reasons are, if any, for the said non-cooperation, and if the special committee, or does the special committee, if reasons have been advanced, find them to be legitimate reasons? And lastly, Mr. Chairman, whether the special committee would be in a position to shed light on what would it take, in its opinion, for Israel to cooperate with the committee. Thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lesotho, and now I invite the distinguished Vice Chairman of the Special Committee, His Excellency, the Permanent Representative of Malaysia. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank all those who have raised the questions. I will attempt to answer them all. And with regard to the question that was presented by the distinguished delegate from Palestine, the expansion of settlements and of the wall lies at the root causes of many of the daily violations of human rights suffered by Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. The severe restriction resulting from the wall violates not only the right to freedom of movements, which you had mentioned. They had effectively prevent Palestinian residents from exercising a wide range of other human rights, including their right to work, to education, to health, to an adequate standard of living, and to development. Farmers are prevented from accessing their fields and from exercising their right to sustain their livelihood. Children are prevented from accessing schools, and students face restriction in choosing their university. Patients are prevented from accessing hospitals, blocking them from exercising their right to the highest sustainable standards of health. Palestinian families, particularly Bedouin refugees families, continues to be forcefully displaced from their homes and land as the route of the wall cuts into their communities and the occupying power seizes the lands and properties. On top of all this, ultimately the wall has implication on the Palestinian rights to self-determination. Israel must cease the construction of the wall and dismantle the parts of the wall situated within the occupied Palestinian territory, including in and around East Jerusalem, as well as to provide repatriation, including restitution and compensation to victims. The illegality of both the walls and the occupied Palestinian territory and the settlements was made clear 10 years ago by the International Court of Justice, yet the situation remains unchanged. The international community's position on the illegality and illegitimacy of the settlement construction was clearly expressed in the Security Council in recent weeks. In this context, I would also affirm the Special Committee's call for the international community to give effect to the legal obligations as contained in the 2004 advisory opinion of the ICJ on the wall, not to recognize the illegal situation resulting from the construction of the wall, not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the construction, and to ensure compliance by Israel with international humanitarian law. On the question made by Pakistan on children, prisoners, Children are particularly vulnerable during the period from their arrest to interrogation. Parents are rarely allowed to be present during interrogation. Access to lawyers before interrogation is equally rare, and children are often forced to sign confession documents in Hebrew, which they do not understand. As underlined in the report, many Palestinian children were reportedly transferred to interrogation and detention centers located in Israel. And as the delegate of Pakistan had pointed out, this is a violation of international law, specifically Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention. I should also draw to the attention of delegations to the relevant section of the report regarding the shocking testimony of a 14-year-old Palestinian boy. This child was arrested at midnight in his home, tortured, forced to confess to accusations, dragged to a military court, and detained for more than 13 months. The accounts indeed a sobering read, and more unfortunately is characteristic of many other similar circumstances. With regard to the physical and psychological well-being of Palestinian children detained by Israel, we heard many cases of children subjected to night life, rape, and arrest, physical violence, verbal abuse, humiliation, and intimidation, strip searching, and denial of adequate food and water. If I could again refer to just one example, that of the aforementioned 14-year-old Palestinian boy, he suffered from excruciating pain in the back and spine, headaches, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, impaired speech, and reduced mobility due to damage incurred to his nervous system. He now continues to suffer from sleep disorder, nightmares, lacks of self-esteem, and self-imposed isolation. In this connection, delegations should recall that last year the Special Committee highlighted a report by UNICEF published in March 2013 regarding children in Israeli military detention, which concluded that the ill treatment of children who come in contact with the military detention system appears to be widespread, systematic, and institutionalized throughout the process, from the moment of arrest until the child's prosecution and eventual conviction and sentencing. In this regard, the committee last year urged Israel, as the state party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to fully implement the UNICEF recommendations to ensure that appropriate practical safeguards are taken immediately to improve the protection of children in military detention. The committee continues to hold the view that not enough has been done to implement the UNICEF recommendations, which include other inter alia provisions on compliance and international norms and regulations, notifications, timing of arrests and warrants, method and instruments of restraint, strip searches, access to lawyers and relatives, judicial reviews, medical examination, interrogation, solitary confinement, conventional evidence, bail, and plea bargains, as well as accountability. I believe one particular relevant point on the detention of children is the age of majority. According to information received last year by the Special Committee, the change in the age of majority for Palestinians from 16 to 18 under Military Orders 1676 has had only a marginal impact upon interrogation and arrest procedures. Committee members were told that Military Order 1676 did not apply to sentencing provisions, and that while the Juvenile Military Court has jurisdiction over children aged 16 and 17, they remain subject to adult sentencing provisions under Israeli military law. Among the recommendations of the committee in relation to Palestinian detainees, in particular children, the Special Committee urged Israel to allow all Palestinian children to have access to a lawyer of their choice prior to interrogation. The committee also called on Israel to prohibit solitary confinement of minors, which among to torture of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment. Israel must also ensure that all incredible reports of torture and ill treatment, including of the children, are investigated promptly, impartially, independently, and thoroughly in line with international standards. With regard to the question by the distinguished delegate of Egypt with regard to the follow-up of the business practices. As in the report, we have already requested for information from the 4 companies. As of to date, we only got 2 responses, in which we will be looking at this response to verify the facts. And at the same time, we will inquire if we could also get the response from the other 2 companies, so that this will be reflected also in our next special committee report. With regard to the question made by the distinguished delegate of Lesotho in terms of 9 cooperation by special committee, as you're aware, if we look at through our reports, every year we were not able to meet with the Israeli representatives, and that we were not allowed to visit the occupied territory. The mission was only able to visit Gaza through the cooperation of the government of Egypt. We would like to call on Israel to cooperate so that we will be able to get a better analysis and assessment of the situation, because sometimes we would blame that we were biased in our report. But in order for us to be objective, we hope that the Israeli government will cooperate with this special committee, so that we will be able to have access as well as information from the various authorities, including from Israel, so that we can prepare a report that would also reflect the views of other parties in this situation. I guess I've answered most of the question. Thank you. Oh, Cuba. On Cuba, there's one question from Cuba. Let me see. On Cuba is about aggression of the Gaza Strip and ongoing illegal blockade. Well, as stated in the report, the special committee believes that now more than ever, a concerted international effort is urgently needed to reverse the effects of repeated Israeli military operations and years of blockade of Gaza. The committee has reiterated its recommendations to lift the blockade, which constitute a form of collective punishment and contravenes international law, specifically Article 33 of the 4th Geneva Convention. The blockade negatively affects the rights to work, health, and education. The enforcement of access restricted areas by Israeli Defense Force continues to lead to injuries and death of Palestinians. Restriction on access to agriculture and fishing grounds undermine Palestinian livelihoods. In relation to maritime territory, the committee heard from representatives of fishermen in Gaza that the fishing limit was 6 nautical miles. However, the fishermen were threatened even before they reached the imposed limit, including with warning shots fired with live ammunition by Israeli naval forces, particularly during the peak fishing season. In this regard, the committee recommends that Israel must, at the minimum, bring the policy and practice in line with what it was agreed as part of the Oslo Accord, namely a 20 nautical miles fishing limit. Gaza is in urgent need of reconstruction and recovery. In this regard, the committee calls upon the international community to provide humanitarian aid and assistance for the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip following the Israeli military operation, and to offer financial contributions to United Nations agencies, including UNRWA, to enable them to carry out their mandates effectively. We hope that the international community will live up to its generous pledges made in Cairo last month. The committee had called upon the United Nations and the international community to apply pressure to ensure the lifting of the blockade, and as an immediate priority, ensure the free movement of humanitarian goods and persons in humanitarian cases. The confirmation earlier this week by the United Nations Special Coordinator for Middle East Peace Process that the temporary Gaza reconstruction mechanism have commenced its operation with an immediate focus on urgent shelter repairs is welcome. Israel, Palestine, and the UN must ensure that the reconstruction mechanism operates smoothly and without delay, to ensure that the reconstruction mechanism operates smoothly and that adequate humanitarian assistance, medical needs, and construction materials are able to enter the enclave. With regard to the recent aggression in Gaza. At the time of the writing of the report, the escalation of hostilities was still ongoing. Therefore, the Special Committee found it premature to draw any conclusions of violations of international law. However, I would add that the committee had welcomed the establishment of an independent international commission of inquiry mandated by the Human Rights Council to investigate violation of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in Gaza, since 13 June 2014. This report will be significant as an initial step towards ensuring accountability. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Malaysia, and now give the floor to Mr. Simonovic.
Thank you very much. I think Ambassador of Malaysia has covered most issues that were raised. I would just like to add that the international community must live up to generous pledges made in Cairo last month, because resources are direly needed, and that Israel, Palestine, and the United Nations must ensure that reconstruction mechanisms operate smoothly and without delay, and that there is adequate humanitarian assistance. Medical needs and construction materials are able to enter the enclave. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Simonovic, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank distinguished chairman of the committee. Listening to him, I have a short question to ask regarding this board of inquiry, which has been mandated to be established by the Human Rights Council to be established. I wonder whether there is any estimation regarding the time, how long does it take to establish the board of inquiry to investigate the level of crimes committed by Israel in Gaza during the last 51-day war against the Gaza people? It was a short question that I am seeking answer from the distinguished chairman of the committee. Thank you.
So, thank you. Thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and give the floor to Mr. Simonovic to respond.
OHCHR was entrusted by the Human Rights Council to establish a commission of inquiry. The commission of inquiry has been established, and the timeline is that they need to report back to the Human Rights Council in March, and this is a work in progress.
I thank Mr. Simonovic, and if there are no further questions and comments, I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Malaysia and the vice chairman of the special committee, as well as Mr. Simonovic, again for their statements and also responses provided to the questions and comments raised. The committee will now begin its general debate on item 51. Before doing so, on an organizational matter, since the list of the speakers of this item has been open for some time, I would like to propose that it be closed at 12 noon today. Delegations who wish to inscribe but have not yet done so are encouraged to approach the Secretariat during the meeting. If I hear no objection, it is so decided. Before we begin our general debate, I would kindly remind speakers to respect the time limit of 10 minutes for national statements and 15 minutes for statements made on behalf of several delegations, especially also with the fact in view that we started a bit late today. The first speaker on the list of speakers is the distinguished representative of the Observer State of Palestine, to whom I give the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and once again I thank Ambassador Hanif, Vice Chair of the Special Committee, for his presentation of the report and for his comprehensive answers during the interactive session. Mr. Chair, there is clearly a human rights crisis in Palestine. Every aspect of life is being infringed upon and every human right is being violated as Israel, the occupying power, continues to subjugate the Palestinian people and to entrench its occupation in total contempt of international law and the global consensus on a peace settlement. While 2014 began on a hopeful note with renewed peace efforts under United States sponsorship, we approach the year's end in a critical state, with peace prospects gravely diminished in the wake of Israel's war against the Gaza Strip and intensification of its destructive colonization campaign throughout the West Bank, particularly in occupied East Jerusalem, and its ongoing collective punishment of the Palestinian people as reflected in the reports before the committee. Israel, its military forces and settlers continue to systematically violate the Palestinian people's right to life, to self-determination, to property, to food, to housing, to water, education, healthcare, livelihood, development, family life, freedom of movement, and freedom of worship. Through an escalation of violence, repressive measures, provocation, and incitement, the occupying power is inflicting widespread hardship, impairing the fabric of our society, destroying the viability of our state, aggravating tensions, destroying trust, and obstructing the prospects for peace. The carnage, trauma, terror, and devastation inflicted by the Israeli war against Gaza are the most shocking reflection of this grave situation. While we await the results of the investigations by the Human Rights Council's Independent Commission of Inquiry, as well as the Secretary General's Board of Inquiry, it is clear that gross human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law amounting to war crimes were committed by Israel in its July and August military aggression, and that a humanitarian disaster was deliberately inflicted by the occupying power. The occupying forces killed more than 2,180 Palestinians, the overwhelming majority civilians, including 516 children and 283 women. Children were killed on beaches as they played, in the sanctity of their homes, in their beds as they slept, in UNRWA schools, in playgrounds, in the arms of their parents who could not save them from the Israeli onslaught. 739 people perished in attacks that killed 3 or more family members in the same incident, including in Israeli bombings that flattened homes atop men, women, children, and elderly, as occurred in Shujaiya, among other areas, where Israel pursued a scorched earth policy, destroying homes and massacring families with a vengeance, laying waste to entire communities, and terrorizing the whole population. More than 11,000 Palestinians were injured, including 3,000 children. 1,500 children have been orphaned, and more than 373,000 traumatized children require psychosocial support, deepening the disfigurement of our society. More than 500,000 people were displaced at the height of the aggression, the largest displacement of the Palestinian civilian population since 1967. More than 80,000 homes were damaged by the occupying forces, with 20,000 homes either completely destroyed or damaged beyond habitation, rendering 110 people homeless. 75 hospitals and medical facilities were damaged in Israeli strikes that repeatedly forced the evacuation of patients and led to civilian casualties. 23 health personnel were killed and 83 injured. More than 100 UN facilities were damaged, including UNRWA schools, where civilians sought safety under the UN flag, yet where many lost their lives in Israeli attacks. More than 33,000 meters of water and waste networks were damaged, exacerbating the water crisis in Gaza, where 90% of the water is unfit for human consumption. 500 economic and industrial properties, constituting 60% of Gaza's production capacity, were destroyed. Mosques, public institutions, and historic sites were also not spared in the Israeli attacks. All the while, the illegal Israeli blockade on Gaza, a repugnant form of collective punishment amounting to a war crime, and the source of countless human rights violations, has persisted, deepening poverty, food insecurity, unemployment, health problems, and many other social and economic ills. Now in its 8th year, this blockade continues to imprison and isolate the entire population and has suffocated socioeconomic life. These facts, as appalling as they are, only partly convey the horrific reality and devastating impact on our people as a result of Israel's aggressions and blockade. As noted in the report, quote, "The effects of the blockade of Gaza are wide-reaching and threaten the very future of Gaza," and quote, "Repeated Israeli military attacks on Gaza had not only inflicted upon the population the burden of rebuilding and dealing with a high number of physical disabilities, but also produced a generation of children in Gaza with psychosocial trauma. Extraordinary efforts will be required to heal the wounds and allay the suffering of grieving families, as well as to reconstruct destroyed homes and infrastructure vital for civilian life. But beyond human and physical rehabilitation, it is essential to ensure accountability for these human rights violations and crimes by the occupying power, because justice is also essential for healing and for any future reconciliation between the Palestinian and Israeli peoples. Mr. Chair, regrettably, the picture is equally grim in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, where Israel continues its repressive occupation policies unabated. Israeli occupying forces continue to use lethal force, killing and injuring Palestinian civilians, including in nonviolent demonstrations against the occupation. Casualties continue to be caused by daily Israeli military raids in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, with the recent period witnessing the killing of yet another Palestinian teenager. The occupying forces also continue to use civilians as human shields, with several such incidents documented in the past year. Daily violent arrest operations continue to be carried out by Israel as it persists imposing this nightmare on Palestinian men and boys in particular, and destroying thousands of lives. As reported, since the occupation began in 1967, more than 850,000 civilians have been held in Israeli prisons and detention facilities. This summer alone, 1,500 Palestinians were arbitrarily arrested and detained in the West Bank. Children also continue to be arrested by the occupying forces, with children as young as 7 years old detained by the army for stone throwing, and many children continue to be seized from their family homes in the dead of night. As reported, an average of 500 to 700 Palestinian children are imprisoned yearly by the occupying power. I am a mother of 2 boys, ages 13 and 8, and I find these facts and the pervasive fears and insecurity endured by Palestinian families as a result of such cruel practices to be horrifying. At this time, more than 6,000 Palestinians remain captive in Israeli prisons and detention centers, including children, women, and parliamentarians. The abuses, ill treatment, and torture to which they are subjected have been fully conveyed in the reports of the Special Committee and today by the distinguished Vice Chair. We also recall the ordeals of detainees who have held hunger strikes, endangering their own lives in peaceful protest against their detention without charge. Mr. Chair, the reports before the committee make abundantly clear the fact that in the past year, Israel, the occupying power, also continued and intensified its illegal settlement colonization campaign, even during the peace negotiations, in violation of UN resolutions, in disrespect of the ICJ advisory opinion, in breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention, Additional Protocol 1, and the relevant provisions of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. More than 23,000 new settlement units were announced or planned by Israeli officials over the past year, including the announcement of at least 1,600 new units over the past 10 days, revealing the occupying powers' malintent and expansionist aims. Settlement construction continues, transfer of Israeli settlers continues, the confiscation of Palestinian lands and properties continues for this colonization project, as does the construction of the wall, a major part of this campaign. Exploitation of natural resources, another massive violation being perpetrated and intimately linked to the Israeli settlement enterprise, also continues unabated. Settlement activities have been a major factor in the occupying powers' forced displacement of hundreds of Palestinian civilians. And in direct connection with this illegal depopulation campaign, Israel has continued to destroy Palestinian property. Violence and terror continue to be perpetrated by extremist Israeli settlers, including against civilians, causing death and injury and creating widespread fear. Settlers continue routinely destroying and vandalizing Palestinian homes and properties, burning olive trees, killing and stealing livestock, and contaminating water supplies and agricultural lands, including with raw sewage. As noted in the report, settler violence appears, quote, to aim at intimidating Palestinians in order to obtain control of certain geographic locations, end quote. And all of this is being perpetrated under the watch and protection of the Israeli occupying forces and with the support of the Israeli government, which bears ultimate responsibility for these crimes. Mr. Chair, this brings me to the crisis in occupied East Jerusalem, where Israel continues its illegal and destructive attempts to alter the demographic composition, character, status, and identity of the city, and to negate Palestinian rights, presence, and connection to the city. Israeli settlement activities have been rabid, with plans being advanced for the construction of thousands of settlement units and continued seizure of Palestinian homes by extremist settlers in the city. Provocations and incitement by Israeli government officials and extremists, particularly at Al-Haram al-Sharif, have been reckless and relentless, as reflected in recent alarming events that are inflaming this highly volatile situation and aggravating religious sensitivities, threatening to ignite another cycle of violence, including precipitation of a religious conflict. This situation has dramatically escalated in past days, compelling our calls for immediate attention and action by the international community, particularly the Security Council, to prevent the explosion of this situation, which would impact the region and far beyond. Mr. Chair, to conclude, despite the gravity of the situation, we have not given up on peace, and we call on the international community to shoulder its responsibilities at this crucial juncture to salvage the small prospects that remain, to make it a reality. Israel, the occupying power, must be demanded to cease immediately and completely all of its illegal policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and to abide scrupulously by all of its legal obligations. And it must be held accountable should it persist with its violations. Accountability is fundamental for ending impunity. We are all too aware that the status quo is unsustainable and that peace will remain elusive if the current conditions persist. The state of Palestine is ready to uphold its obligations and commitments to make peace a reality. However, a real partner for peace is missing, and here the role of the international community foremost the Security Council, is vital. In closing, we again appeal for the international community's support in this noble endeavor, and we reaffirm our deep appreciation to the Special Committee for its important contributions in this regard. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of the observer state of Palestine, and now give the floor to the next speaker on my list, who is the distinguished ambassador and Sajid Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran, speaking on behalf of the non-aligned movement. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Mr. Chairman, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the non-aligned movement. I'm thankful to the chair and members of the Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people and other Arabs of the occupied territories for their valuable efforts and comprehensive report. Mr. Chairman, according to the latest report of the Special Committee, Israel's policies and practices continue to violate fundamental human rights and dignity of the Palestinian people and other Arabs living under its occupation. The non-aligned movement is seriously concerned about the disturbing finding of the report, especially regarding the situation of Palestinian prisoners and detainees, including women and children in in Israeli prisons, as well as the vastly detrimental impact of the illegal Israeli settlement campaign throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip due to the illegal Israeli blockade and successive military aggression. NAM reiterates condemnation of the Israeli military aggressions against the Palestinian people, including the deadly aggression against the Gaza Strip in last July and August. The heavy toll it took among Palestinian civilians is shocking, not only because it far exceeded that of the similar Israeli military aggression in 2008 and 2009, but also because many among them were women, children, and elderly, and also because of the massive civilian displacement caused, where nearly 500,000 people were displaced at one point during the conflict. The large-scale destruction by Israeli airstrikes and shelling of homes and civilian infrastructure, including the attack on Gaza's only power plant, as well as schools, hospitals, and water and sanitation infrastructures, and the destruction of the United Nations facilities is nothing short of a disaster for Gaza, and the human rights violations are immense. In this regard, NAM welcomes the decision by the Human Rights Council to dispatch an international, independent inquiry into all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law resulting from the recent Israeli military aggression against the besieged Gaza Strip. Excuse me. NAM stresses the need to fully investigate all violations by the occupying power of international humanitarian law and human rights law in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, towards establishing accountability and justice for the many victims of these crimes. NAM also calls upon Israel, the occupying power, to promptly and unconditionally end its illegal blockade of Gaza and open all its crossing points in accordance with international humanitarian law and all UN resolutions, including Security Council Resolution 1860/2009. Mr. Chairman, as reflected in the report of the Special Committee, since 1967, the overall number of detainees held in Israeli prisons and military detention facilities has exceeded the staggering figure of 850,000, the vast majority of whom were Palestinians, including 25,000 children. As at June 2014, 5,243 Palestinian detainees were held in Israeli custody in more than 17 prisons, detention centers, and military camps in the occupied West Bank and in Israel, out of which 198 were children, and some of whom were detained without charge, and the youngest was 14 years old. With the wave of arrests during the recent crisis, the number of Palestinian prisoners and detainees has exceeded 6,000 persons. It is the conviction of the movement, as stated in the Declaration on Palestine Political Prisoners, adopted by the 16th Summit of Heads of State or Government of the Non-Aligned Movement, held in Tehran in August 2012, as well as by the 17th Ministerial Conference of the Non-Aligned Movement held in Algiers, Algeria, in May 2014, that the Palestinian prisoners and detainees should be immediately released and their plight should be addressed by the international community, particularly the Security Council and the Human Rights Council. It is disturbing that Israel, the occupying power, continues to pursue such illegal practices with blatant impunity despite the prohibitions of such actions under international law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention, relevant United Nations resolutions, and the 2004 ICJ advisory opinion. The impact of these illegal measures on the Palestinian civilian population, including women and children, and the most vulnerable, such as the Palestine refugee population, must be seriously considered, and measures must be taken in accordance with international law to remedy this injustice. Mr. Chairman, Israeli settlement activities continue through a combination of illegal policies and practices, including the confiscation of land, construction of settlements and the wall, and the demolition of homes and structures, in addition to the forced displacement of Palestinian civilians, among them Bedouin and herder communities, and the denial of residency rights, particularly in East Jerusalem. These illegal colonization practices are most intense in and around occupied East Jerusalem, where Israeli provocation and incitement, including at holy sites, has dangerously intensified, threatening to further destabilize this critical situation. Israeli settler violence also continued to result in Palestinian civilian casualties and destruction of property, and was reported to be a factor that contributed to forcing Palestinians off their land. These illegal activities are undermining the contiguity of the West Bank and violate right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, as well as many other human rights as detailed in the reports. In this regard, NAM calls for urgent action and practical measures by the international community, in particular the Security Council, to compel the occupying power to cease completely its illegal and destructive settlement campaign in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and to abide by all of its obligations under international law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention, UN resolutions, the advisory opinion of ICJ, and its obligations under the roadmap. Mr. Chairman, turning to Syrian Golan, the non-aligned movement reaffirms once again that all unlawful actions by Israel, the occupying power, since 1967 constitute a clear violation of international law, the UN Charter and relevant resolutions, including Security Council Resolution 497, 1981, and the Fourth Geneva Convention. NAM demands that Israel abide by Resolution 497 and withdraw completely from the occupied Syrian Golan to the borders of 4th June 1967. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, the movement reaffirms its unwavering commitment to a just and comprehensive solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, with the question of Palestine at its core, and to the immediate restoration of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to exercise their self-determination and sovereignty in its independent state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and a just solution for the plight of the Palestinian refugees on the basis of General Assembly Resolution 194, Roman 3. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the distinguished ambassador and representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, speaking on behalf of the non-aligned movement. And I now give the